There are Pokemon games that most fans have never played, not because they're bad or unpopular, but because they were released exclusively on the Nintendo GameCube, a console that sold far fewer units than the Game Boy Advance that was dominating the market at the time. These games, Pokemon Colosseum and Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, introduced a concept so dark and disturbing that it's never been used in a main series game since. They introduced Shadow Pokémon, creatures that have had their hearts artificially closed, turning them into fighting machines incapable of feeling emotion or forming bonds with trainers. Tonight, we're going to explore what Shadow Pokémon are, how they were created, and why these GameCube games remain some of the darkest entries in the entire Pokemon franchise. Pokemon Colosseum was released in 2003 for the GameCube, and it was different from every Pokemon game that had come before it. There was no professor giving you a starter. There was no journey to become champion. There were no wild Pokemon to catch in tall grass. Instead, you played as Wes, a former member of a criminal organization called Team Snagging, operating in the Ori region, a desert wasteland with no wild Pokemon and a thriving black market for stolen Pokemon. The game opened with Wes betraying Team Snagging, stealing their snag machine, a device that could capture Pokemon that already belonged to other trainers, and blowing up their headquarters as he escaped. The snag machine is central to understanding how Colosseum works. In normal Pokemon games, you can only catch wild Pokemon. Trying to catch another trainer's Pokemon results in the Pokeball being deflected with the message that it's wrong to catch someone else's Pokemon. But the snag machine bypasses this restriction, allowing you to steal Pokemon from other trainers. This mechanic would be morally questionable in any other context, but Colosseum justifies it by introducing Shadow Pokémon, creatures that have been corrupted by an organization called Cypher and need to be rescued. Cypher is the main antagonist organization in both Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness. They're a criminal syndicate operating in Ori, and they've developed a process to create Shadow Pokémon by artificially closing the door to a Pokémon's heart. This process is never fully explained in scientific terms, but the results are clear. A Shadow Pokémon loses its ability to feel emotions, stops responding to its trainer's commands with any kind of affection or loyalty, and becomes purely focused on battling and causing harm. Its eyes become cold and empty. Its behavior becomes aggressive and mechanical. And most disturbingly, it can use Shadow-type moves, attacks that are super effective against all non-Shadow Pokemon and can't be used by any Pokemon that hasn't been corrupted. The visual design of Shadow Pokemon reflects their corrupted state. They're surrounded by a dark purple aura, a shadowy energy that pulses around their bodies during battle. Their eyes glow red or appear hollow and emotionless. When they're sent into battle, instead of the normal Pokeball opening animation, they emerge in a burst of dark energy that looks fundamentally wrong, as if the Pokemon is being forcibly ejected from the ball rather than choosing to come out. And during battle, Shadow Pokemon sometimes enter a state called reverse mode, where they become so consumed by the darkness in their hearts that they stop obeying commands entirely and might even hurt themselves. Reverse mode is one of the most disturbing aspects of Shadow Pokemon. When it happens, the Pokemon's eyes flash, the dark aura intensifies, and the Pokemon becomes uncontrollable. It might attack when you don't command it to, or it might refuse to attack when you do. In this state, the Pokemon is suffering, trapped in a cycle of aggression and pain that it can't escape from. The only way to bring a Shadow Pokemon out of reverse mode is to use the call command, where your character calls out to the Pokemon, trying to reach whatever small part of its heart might still be open. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the Pokemon responds to your voice and calms down. Sometimes it doesn't, and the Pokemon stays trapped in reverse mode until the battle ends. This mechanic creates an emotional weight that most Pokemon games don't have. You're not just battling opponents to level up your team, you're rescuing Pokemon from a fate worse than being caught, worse than being released, arguably worse than death. These Pokemon have been turned into weapons, stripped of everything that makes them Pokemon rather than just monsters. And it's your job to steal them away from the trainers, using them to snag them with the snag machine, and then to begin the long process of purification. Purification is how you restore a shadow Pokemon to normal. It's not instant, and it's not automatic. You have to work for it, spending time with the Pokemon, using it in battles, and gradually opening its heart through various methods. In Colosseum, you could purify shadow Pokemon by calling them during battle when they entered reverse mode, by keeping them in your active party, or by taking them to special locations called purification chambers, where the presence of other Pokemon with positive emotions would slowly influence the shadow Pokemon. In XD Gale of Darkness, the purification system became more complex. The game introduced the Purify Chamber, a facility where you could place shadow Pokemon surrounded by sets of normal Pokemon with specific type combinations. If you arrange the normal Pokemon correctly, their positive energy would flow into the shadow Pokemon and accelerate the purification process. It was a puzzle system that required thought and strategy, reflecting the idea that purification isn't just about time passing, but about actively creating the right conditions for a Pokemon's heart to heal. When a shadow Pokemon is fully purified, the transformation is dramatic. The dark aura disappears. The Pokemon's eyes return to normal. Its behavior changes immediately, becoming friendly and responsive. And most importantly, it forgets all its shadow-type moves and remembers the normal moves it should have learned at its current level. The Pokemon is restored to what it was before Scizor corrupted it, though there's always the lingering question of whether it remembers what it went through as a shadow Pokemon, whether it carries trauma from the time its heart was closed. The games treat purification as unconditionally good, as rescuing Pokemon from suffering, but they also acknowledge that it's not easy and that shadow Pokemon are dangerous even to the trainers trying to save them. A shadow Pokemon, in reverse mode, might use a powerful attack at the wrong time and knock out your other Pokemon. It might waste turns, refusing to follow commands. Using shadow Pokemon effectively requires balancing their power, because they are often higher level and stronger than normal Pokemon you'd have at that point in the game, with the risk that they'll become uncontrollable and hurt your team. The existence of shadow Pokemon raises questions about Pokemon ethics that the main series games usually avoid. If it's possible to artificially close a Pokemon's heart and turn it into an emotionless weapon, what does that say about the nature of Pokemon consciousness? Are Pokemon's emotions and bonds with trainers just biological processes that can be manipulated with the right technology, or is there something deeper that Scizor's process damages but can't completely destroy? The fact that purification works, that shadow Pokemon can be restored, suggests that the heart-closing process isn't permanent, that something essential about the Pokemon remains even when it's been corrupted. Scizor's motivation for creating shadow Pokemon is purely practical and evil. They want powerful Pokemon that obey commands without question, that can be used for crime and conquest without any risk that the Pokemon might refuse orders or show mercy. In Colosseum, Scizor is distributing shadow Pokemon to criminals and corrupt officials throughout Ori, building an army of corrupted Pokemon that can't be stopped by conventional means. In XD Gale of Darkness, they've refined the process and are working toward creating the ultimate shadow Pokemon, something so powerful and so completely corrupted that it can never be purified. The people who use shadow Pokemon are portrayed as clearly villainous. They're not misguided trainers who think they're helping their Pokemon. They're criminals who know exactly what shadow Pokemon are and use them anyway because they want power without having to earn a Pokemon's trust or loyalty. The trainers you snag shadow Pokemon from are often members of Cypher or criminal organizations allied with Cypher, people who have no qualms about using corrupted Pokemon for theft, violence, and intimidation. But the games also show that not everyone in Ori is corrupt. There are resistance members fighting against Cypher, good people trying to protect Pokemon and stop the spread of shadow Pokemon. Your character in both games is technically a criminal, someone who steals Pokemon from other trainers, but you're stealing them for the purpose of rescue and purification. The snag machine, which Team Snagem created for crime, becomes a tool for justice when used to liberate shadow Pokemon. The Ori region itself reflects the darkness of the shadow Pokemon concept. It's a desert wasteland with almost no natural Pokemon habitats, no routes with tall grass where wild Pokemon live, no forests or lakes teeming with life. It's a region that feels dead or dying, where Pokemon only exist because humans brought them there, and where crime and corruption have filled the vacuum left by the absence of a natural ecosystem. Shadow Pokemon fit perfectly into this setting because they represent the same kind of corruption, the same replacement of natural bonds and emotions with artificial control and exploitation. The two GameCube games together tell a story about how far people will go for power and control, and about whether corruption can be reversed through dedication and care. They're darker than main series Pokemon games, more willing to show Pokemon suffering and to make the player complicit in that suffering by forcing you to use shadow Pokemon in battles even as you work to purify them. They ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of Pokemon, about what separates a partner from a weapon, and about whether redemption is possible for creatures that have been fundamentally changed by cruelty. Shadow Pokemon represent one of the Pokemon franchise's most disturbing concepts, and the fact that they've never appeared in a main series game suggests that Game Freak recognized they were too dark for the typical Pokemon experience. But in the context of the GameCube games, in the wasteland of Ori where crime and corruption reign, shadow Pokemon work perfectly as both a gameplay mechanic and a narrative device. They give you a reason to steal Pokemon, a moral justification for using the snag machine, and a concrete goal beyond just winning battles. You're not just trying to become champion, you're trying to save Pokemon from a fate that strips away everything that makes them more than just tools for fighting. For over a decade after Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness released in 2005, Shadow Pokemon disappeared from the franchise entirely. No main series game referenced them. No spin-off brought back the concept. The GameCube games became cult classics, beloved by the people who played them, but largely forgotten by the wider Pokemon community, simply because so few people owned a GameCube and had access to these games. Shadow Pokemon seemed destined to remain a unique experiment that Game Freak tried once and never revisited. But the concept was too compelling to stay buried forever, and the impact of Shadow Pokemon on the franchise proved to be deeper and longer lasting than anyone expected. The most obvious sign of Shadow Pokemon's legacy is the constant demand from fans for remakes or ports of Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness. These requests have been ongoing for nearly 2 decades, with fans asking Nintendo and Game Freak to bring the games to modern consoles. The Nintendo Switch seems like the perfect platform for these games, with its ability to handle 3D graphics and its status as Nintendo's primary console. But as of now, no remakes have been announced, and the GameCube games remain locked to their original hardware. This demand exists for several reasons. First, the GameCube had a relatively small install base compared to Nintendo's handheld systems, which means many Pokemon fans never had the opportunity to play Colosseum or XD when they were new. Second, the games offered a completely different experience from the main series, with their focus on double battles, their mature storyline, and their unique region devoid of wild Pokemon. And third, Shadow Pokemon themselves were such a unique and dark concept that fans who experience them want to see that darkness explored again, while fans who miss them want the chance to experience it for the first time. The cultural impact of Shadow Pokemon extends beyond just the people who played the GameCube games. Shadow Lugia, also known as XD1, became an iconic design despite never appearing in a main series game. The corrupted, dark purple version of Lugia, with red eyes and a menacing presence, captured players' imaginations and became a popular subject for fan art, theories, and discussions. Shadow Lugia represents the Shadow Pokemon concept at its most extreme, a legendary Pokemon corrupted into something that barely resembles its original form, and that visual stuck with people, even if they never actually played XD Gale of Darkness. But the most significant evidence of Shadow Pokemon's lasting impact came in 2019, when Pokemon Go introduced Shadow Pokemon to the mobile game. Team Go Rocket, a revived version of the classic villainous team, began appearing at Pokestops with Shadow Pokemon. These weren't exactly the same as the GameCube Shadow Pokemon. They had different mechanics, different visual effects, and a different purification system, but the core concept was the same: Pokemon that had been corrupted by a villainous organization, given a dark appearance and aggressive behavior, and needing to be rescued and purified by the player. Pokemon Go's Shadow Pokemon have a black and purple aura surrounding them, and their eyes glow red, similar to the GameCube versions. When you encounter them in battle against Team Go Rocket grunts, they behave more aggressively than normal Pokemon, and when you defeat a grunt, you get the opportunity to catch one of their Shadow Pokemon, rescuing it from Team Go Rocket's control. Once caught, you can choose to purify the Shadow Pokemon, which changes its appearance back to normal, decreases the cost to power it up, and sometimes changes its moves. The introduction of Shadow Pokemon to Pokemon Go proved that the concept still resonated with players. It gave millions of Pokemon fans their first experience with Shadow Pokemon, exposing a whole new generation to the idea that had originated in the obscure GameCube games. And it demonstrated that Shadow Pokemon could work in different contexts, not just in the story-driven console games, but also in a mobile game focused on collection and casual gameplay. However, Pokemon Go's implementation of Shadow Pokemon is notably less dark than the original GameCube versions. There's no reverse mode where Shadow Pokemon hurt themselves or become completely uncontrollable. There's no deep dive into the psychological horror of having a Pokemon's heart artificially closed. The purification process is simple and instant, requiring just some stardust and candy rather than the time-consuming bonding and care that the GameCube games required. Pokemon Go took the aesthetic and basic concept of Shadow Pokemon, but stripped away most of the disturbing implications that made them so memorable in Colosseum and XD. This lighter treatment makes sense for Pokemon Go's audience and format. A mobile game played by millions of people of all ages can't dive as deep into dark themes as a console game aimed at a more dedicated audience. But it also highlights why Shadow Pokemon have never appeared in a main series game. The concept is inherently dark, dealing with themes of abuse, corruption, and the stripping away of consciousness and free will. Main series Pokemon games, which are designed to be accessible to children and maintain a generally optimistic tone, would struggle to incorporate Shadow Pokemon without either watering them down to the point where they lose their impact or making the games notably darker than the franchise typically allows. The influence of shadow Pokémon can be seen in other Pokémon concepts, even when they're not explicitly called shadow Pokémon. The primal reversion of Kyogre and Groudon in Omega, Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire, where these legendary Pokémon become more aggressive and lose control of their power, echoes the reverse mode of shadow Pokémon. The Ultra Beasts in Sun and Moon, Pokémon from another dimension that behave strangely and don't fit normal Pokémon patterns, share some conceptual DNA with shadow Pokémon as creatures that exist outside the normal bond between Pokémon and trainer. Dynamax and Gigantamax in Sword and Shield show Pokémon losing control and rampaging, requiring the player to calm them down, similar to how shadow Pokémon in reverse mode need to be called back to their senses. And the corrupted noble Pokémon in Legends Arceus, driven into a frenzy by external forces and needing to be calmed before they can be helped, are perhaps the closest the main series has come to recreating the shadow Pokémon experience. These frenzied Pokémon have red eyes, behave aggressively, and need to be rescued from their corrupted state, hitting many of the same beats as shadow Pokémon without using the same terminology or mechanics. These echoes suggest that Game Freak recognizes the appeal of the shadow Pokémon concept, the idea of Pokémon that need to be saved rather than just caught, Pokémon that have been corrupted and need to be restored. But they also suggest that Game Freak is cautious about going as far as Colosseum and XD did, preferring to explore similar themes in ways that feel less permanently damaging to the Pokémon and less explicitly about abuse and control. The possibility of shadow Pokémon returning in a future game remains a topic of speculation among fans. Some believe that a proper remake or sequel to Colosseum and XD is inevitable, that Nintendo will eventually bring these games to modern consoles and introduce a new generation to the Ore region. Others think that Game Freak might incorporate shadow Pokémon into a main series game, perhaps as a post-game feature or as part of a darker storyline in a game aimed at older players. And some believe that Pokémon Go's implementation of shadow Pokémon is as close as the franchise will get to bringing the concept back, that the mobile game will continue to be the primary place where new players experience shadow Pokémon. What's certain is that shadow Pokémon left a mark on the franchise that has never fully faded. Players who experienced Colosseum and XD remember the emotional weight of purifying shadow Pokémon, the satisfaction of taking a corrupted creature and restoring it to health and happiness. They remember the unique challenge of battling with Pokémon that might turn against you at any moment. And they remember Shadow Lugia, the ultimate shadow Pokémon, as one of the most striking and memorable Pokémon designs in the entire franchise, despite appearing in only one game. The GameCube games proved that Pokémon could support darker, more mature storytelling without losing what makes the franchise special. They showed that the bond between trainer and Pokémon could be tested and strained in ways that main series games rarely explore. And they created a concept, shadow Pokémon, that was so compelling and so well executed that fans continued to request its return nearly 2 decades later. Whether shadow Pokémon ever appear in a main series game, whether the GameCube games get the remakes fans are asking for, or whether Pokémon Go remains the only active implementation of the concept, the legacy of shadow Pokémon is secure. They represent a road not taken by the main series, a glimpse of what Pokémon could be if it fully embraced darker themes and more complex moral questions. And for the fans who played Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness, who spent hours purifying shadow Pokémon and fighting against Cypher's corruption, that legacy is more than enough to ensure that shadow Pokémon will never be forgotten. Among all the shadow Pokémon that Cypher created, one stands above the rest as the ultimate expression of their corruption and cruelty. It has a designation rather than just a name, XD1, It's referred to as the shadow Pokemon that can never be purified, the pinnacle of Cypher's research into closing Pokemon's hearts. And it's a corrupted version of one of the most beloved and iconic legendary Pokemon in the entire franchise. XD1 is Shadow Lugia, and it's the reason Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness exists as a game. Shadow Lugia's design is immediately striking and deeply wrong in a way that makes it memorable. Normal Lugia is elegant and beautiful, a white and blue legendary Pokemon associated with the sea and with calm, peaceful energy. Shadow Lugia takes that design and corrupts it into something that looks diseased and hostile. Its body is a dark, grayish purple, the color of a deep bruise or rotting flesh. Its eyes glow a menacing red instead of Lugia's normal blue. Dark purple and black aura surrounds it constantly, and the energy emanating from its body looks almost like flames or smoke, suggesting something burning from the inside out. The visual design communicates everything you need to know about what was done to this Pokemon. This isn't just a Pokemon with a closed heart like the other Shadow Pokemon. This is a Pokemon that has been fundamentally altered, corrupted so deeply that it barely resembles what it's supposed to be. Where other Shadow Pokemon retain their normal appearance, aside from the dark aura, Shadow Lugia looks like a completely different creature, as if the process of closing its heart physically transformed it into something monstrous. The XD in XD1 stands for Extra Darkness, Cypher's designation for their most advanced Shadow Pokemon research. The 001 indicates that Shadow Lugia was the first and primary subject of this research, the prototype for a new generation of Shadow Pokemon that would be impossible to purify. Cypher's scientists believed they had perfected the heart-closing process with XD1, creating a Shadow Pokemon so completely corrupted that no amount of care or purification attempts could restore it to normal. They were wrong, but the fact that they tried to create an unpurifiable Pokemon speaks to how far they were willing to go in their pursuit of the perfect weapon. Shadow Lugia is encountered at the Citadark Isle, Cypher's main fortress and research facility. This is late in Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, near the end of the game's story, and the build-up to facing Shadow Lugia has been continuous throughout your journey. You've heard about XD1 in reports and conversations. You've learned that Cypher's ultimate goal is to create and mass-produce Pokemon like it, and you've been told repeatedly that Shadow Lugia cannot be purified, that attempting to save it is pointless because it's too far gone. When you finally encounter Shadow Lugia, it's being held in a massive chamber designed specifically to contain it. The Pokemon is clearly suffering, thrashing and releasing bursts of dark energy, completely consumed by the corruption in its heart. Cypher's leader, Greevil, uses Shadow Lugia as his final Pokemon in the battle against you, sending it out with complete confidence that nothing can stand against the ultimate Shadow Pokemon. And he's not entirely wrong. Shadow Lugia is level 50, significantly higher than most Pokemon you'll have at that point in the game, and it knows powerful Shadow-type moves that can devastate your team. The battle against Shadow Lugia is one of the most intense moments in either GameCube Pokemon game. You need to weaken it enough to capture it with the snag machine, but you can't knock it out or you'll fail to rescue it. Shadow Lugia's stats are those of a legendary Pokemon, making it bulky and difficult to take down safely. And because it's a Shadow Pokemon, it can enter reverse mode at any time, becoming even more dangerous and unpredictable. You need to balance dealing damage with keeping your own team alive, all while managing the risk that Shadow Lugia might go berserk and either knock itself out or destroy your entire team. Once you successfully snag Shadow Lugia and add it to your team, the game presents you with a problem that defines the entire purpose of Pokemon XD. You now have a Pokemon that, according to all the information you've been given, cannot be purified. The game's main purification facility, the Purify Chamber, should be able to handle any shadow Pokémon if you arrange the normal Pokémon around it correctly. But Shadow Lugia is different. It's been corrupted on a deeper level, and standard purification methods aren't enough. This is where the Purify Chamber becomes central to the story. Throughout Pokémon XD, you've been upgrading this facility, increasing its power and capacity. By the time you capture Shadow Lugia, you've hopefully maximized the Purify Chamber's potential, because that's what it takes to purify XD1. You need to place Shadow Lugia in the chamber surrounded by perfectly arranged sets of normal Pokémon, creating a flow of positive energy so strong that it can break through even extra darkness corruption. The purification of Shadow Lugia is presented as a major achievement, proof that Cypher's scientists were wrong and that no Pokémon is beyond saving. When Shadow Lugia is finally purified, the transformation is dramatic. The dark gray-purple coloring fades away, replaced by Lugia's normal white and blue. The red eyes return to their natural blue. The dark aura dissipates completely, and the Pokémon that emerges is a normal Lugia, free from corruption, capable of feeling emotions and forming bonds again. But the process raises questions that the game doesn't fully answer. What did Shadow Lugia experience while it was corrupted? Does it remember being XD1? Remember the pain of having its heart closed so completely that it physically transformed? The game treats purification as a complete restoration, but there's an implication that something this severe might leave scars that aren't visible. Lugia is a legendary Pokémon associated with peace and calm seas. Having that nature twisted into something violent and corrupt seems like it should have lasting effects, but the game doesn't explore that possibility. Shadow Lugia also raises the question of how Cypher obtained a Lugia in the first place. Lugia is one of the rarest Pokémon in existence, a legendary creature that appears only in specific locations under specific circumstances. Cypher somehow captured one, brought it to their facility, and subjected it to their most extreme heart-closing process. The game never explains how they accomplished this, whether they lured Lugia into a trap or found some way to force it to submit. This gap in the story adds to Shadow Lugia's mystery, but also highlights how little we know about Cypher's full capabilities. The existence of XD1 suggests that Cypher's ultimate plan was to create an army of unpurifiable shadow Pokémon. If they could perfect the extra darkness process and apply it to multiple Pokémon, not just legendaries but common Pokémon as well, they would have an unstoppable force that couldn't be rescued or redeemed. Every Pokémon they corrupted would be permanently lost, transformed into a weapon that could never be restored. The player stopping this plan by proving that even XD1 can be purified represents a victory not just over Cypher, but over the very concept of irreversible corruption. Shadow Lugia's moveset, when you first capture it, reflects its corrupted state. It knows Shadow-type moves that normal Lugia would never have. Attacks like Shadow Blast and Shadow Storm that deal massive damage to non-Shadow Pokémon. These moves are powerful, making Shadow Lugia an incredibly strong team member even before purification. But using these moves means accepting that you're using a Pokémon in its corrupted state, taking advantage of the very thing you're supposed to be trying to fix. It creates a moral tension where the game mechanics encourage you to use Shadow Lugia's power, while the narrative tells you that keeping it as a shadow Pokémon is cruel. Once purified, Shadow Lugia loses all its Shadow-type moves and learns the normal moves that a Lugia of its level should know. It becomes a regular legendary Pokémon, powerful and useful, but no longer unique in the way it was as XD1. Some players actually preferred Shadow Lugia's aesthetic and power, viewing the purification as making it less special rather than more. This reflects a common tension in discussions about shadow Pokémon. The corrupted versions are often more interesting and powerful than their purified forms, creating a strange situation where the game punishes you mechanically for doing the right thing morally. Shadow Lugia has become an icon in Pokémon fan communities, despite never appearing in a main series game. Fan art of Shadow Lugia is common, often depicting it as a tragic figure rather than a simple villain, a Pokémon suffering under corruption rather than embracing it. Some fans have created elaborate theories about Shadow Lugia representing the dark side of legendary Pokémon, the idea that creatures of such immense power could be twisted into forces of destruction if someone cruel enough gained control over them. The fact that Shadow Lugia can be purified is important to Pokémon XD's overall message. The game is fundamentally about redemption and rescue, about the idea that no corruption is permanent and no Pokémon is beyond saving. Shadow Lugia is the ultimate test of this premise. If even XD1, designed specifically to be unpurifiable, can have its heart opened again through care and the positive influence of other Pokémon, then the concept of permanent corruption is false. Cypher's entire philosophy, that Pokémon can be reduced to weapons and tools through closing their hearts, is proven wrong by Shadow Lugia's purification. XD1 represents the darkest possibility in the Pokémon world, the idea that the bond between Pokémon and humans could be not just broken but inverted, turned into a source of suffering rather than joy. And the player's ability to reverse that corruption, to save even the most damaged Pokémon, is what makes Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness a story about hope, despite its dark premise. Not every shadow Pokémon is a legendary creature or a pseudo-legendary powerhouse. Some are common Pokémon that you might find in any tall grass on any route in a normal Pokémon game. Shadow Pinsir is one of these, a bug-type Pokémon that's relatively ordinary compared to the likes of Shadow Lugia or Shadow Metagross. But what makes Shadow Pinsir significant isn't its rarity or power level. It's what it represents about Cypher's operations and their willingness to corrupt any Pokémon, regardless of whether it's special or common, legendary or everyday. Shadow Pinsir appears in Pokémon Colosseum, the first of the 2 GameCube games. You encounter it being used by a member of Cypher, one of the many trainers scattered throughout the Ori region who have been supplied with shadow Pokémon to carry out the organization's operations. Pinsir isn't handed to an admin or a high-ranking member. It's given to a relatively low-level operative, someone who needs a strong Pokémon but doesn't warrant being trusted with anything truly rare or irreplaceable. This distribution pattern reveals something important about how Cypher operates. They're not just corrupting legendary Pokémon for their own use. They're mass-producing shadow Pokémon and handing them out to criminals, corrupt officials, and anyone else who can help advance Cypher's goals. Shadow Pinsir is part of this mass production, a common Pokémon transformed into a shadow Pokémon and distributed like a weapon to someone who will use it without question or remorse. The encounter with Shadow Pinsir typically happens in the middle portion of Pokémon Colosseum, after you've already snagged several shadow Pokémon and begun to understand how the system works. By this point, you've likely purified at least 1 or 2 shadow Pokémon and seen the transformation from corrupted to normal. You've experienced the satisfaction of rescuing a Pokémon from Cypher's control, and then you encounter Shadow Pinsir, and you have to decide whether to add another bug type to your purification queue or focus on other shadow Pokémon that might be more useful to your team. This decision is part of what makes Colosseum's design interesting. You can't catch wild Pokémon in Ori, so every Pokémon you have comes from either your starting team or from snagging shadow Pokémon. This means you have limited opportunities to build your team. and every shadow Pokemon you snag is a commitment. You need to purify it eventually, which takes time and effort. You need to decide whether it's worth using a team slot on this Pokemon or whether you should wait for a different shadow Pokemon that fits your strategy better. Shadow Pinsir is a decent choice for players who need a physical attacker. Pinsir has high attack and solid physical bulk, making it capable of dealing and taking hits. As a bug type, it provides coverage against psychic, dark, and grass-type Pokemon, which are common in Colosseum's trainer battles. And while it's not as flashy as some of the other shadow Pokemon available, Pinsir is reliable and effective when used correctly. But Shadow Pinsir also highlights one of the ethical dimensions of the shadow Pokemon concept that's easy to overlook. When you're rescuing Shadow Lugia or Shadow Metagross, it feels heroic because you're saving a rare and powerful Pokemon from corruption. But when you're snagging Shadow Pinsir, a Pokemon that's common enough that you could probably catch dozens of them in any region with wild Pokemon, the act of rescue feels different. You're not saving something irreplaceable. You're saving this specific Pinsir because it's the one that was corrupted, because it's suffering, not because it's special or valuable. This distinction matters because it reinforces the game's message that every Pokemon deserves to be saved, not just the rare or powerful ones. Cypher doesn't discriminate in their corruption. They'll close the heart of a legendary Pokemon just as readily as they'll close the heart of a common bug type. And your response as the player should be the same regardless of what Pokemon you're rescuing. Shadow Pinsir deserves purification just as much as Shadow Lugia does, even though one is a legendary and the other isn't. The purification process for Shadow Pinsir is the same as for any other shadow Pokemon in Colosseum. You need to use it in battles, call to it when it enters reverse mode, and gradually build up its purification gauge. In Colosseum, there's a meter that shows how close a shadow Pokemon is to being fully purified, and watching that meter fill up as you work with the Pokemon creates a sense of progress and accomplishment. Shadow Pinsir might not be the most difficult Pokemon to purify, but seeing it transform from a corrupted creature with red eyes and a dark aura into a normal Pinsir that can feel emotions again is satisfying regardless of its tier in the competitive meta. When Shadow Pinsir is purified, it learns the moves it should have at its current level, replacing the shadow-type moves it had while corrupted. This usually includes strong bug-type moves like Scizor or physical coverage moves that make Pinsir a solid team member. The purified Pinsir can then be used normally, trained up, and even transferred to other Pokemon games through the GameCube to Game Boy Advance link cable, allowing players to bring their rescued Pokemon into the main series games. This transfer capability is significant because it means shadow Pokemon, once purified, become normal Pokemon that can exist in any game. A purified Shadow Pinsir is indistinguishable from a Pinsir caught in the wild or bred from parents. There's no permanent mark on the Pokemon indicating it was once corrupted. The only way to know is if you remember its history, if you were the one who snagged it from a Cypher trainer and spent the time purifying it. This suggests that purification truly does restore the Pokemon to its original state, erasing the effects of Cypher's corruption completely. Shadow Pinsir also represents the reality that not every shadow Pokemon you encounter will be one you want to use on your team. Colosseum forces you to snag shadow Pokemon to progress the story and to prevent Cypher from using them, but you don't have to use all of them in battles. Some players snag Shadow Pinsir, purify it as quickly as possible, and then box it, never using it in their main team. This is a valid approach, but it also creates a strange feeling where you're rescuing Pokemon and then immediately benching them, saving them from corruption, but not actually forming a bond with them. The game doesn't judge you for this. The goal is to purify shadow Pokemon, not necessarily to use them all, but it does create a contrast with how the games usually present the player-Pokemon relationship. Normally, the Pokemon on your team are the ones you've chosen to journey with, the partners you've trained and bonded with. In Colosseum, many of your Pokemon are refugees you've rescued, creatures you've saved but might not actually want to travel with. Shadow Pinsir often falls into this category, a Pokemon worth saving but not necessarily worth using. There's also the question of what happens to Shadow Pokemon that players don't snag. If you encounter a trainer with a Shadow Pinsir and you choose not to battle them or you defeat them without using the snag machine, that Shadow Pokemon remains corrupted. The game doesn't force you to save every Shadow Pokemon, though it does track which ones you've missed and gives you opportunities to encounter them again later. But theoretically, you could finish Colosseum without snagging every Shadow Pokemon, leaving some of them permanently corrupted and in the hands of Cypher's operatives. This possibility adds weight to the player's choices. Every Shadow Pokemon you encounter is a Pokemon in need of rescue, and choosing not to save them means accepting that they'll continue to suffer under Cypher's control. Shadow Pinsir might not be special compared to some of the other Shadow Pokemon available, but it's still a living creature that's been abused and corrupted, and leaving it in that state because you don't think a bug type would be useful to your team feels cruel even though the game allows it. Shadow Pinsir ultimately serves as a reminder that Cypher's evil isn't limited to corrupting rare and powerful Pokemon. They're willing to corrupt anything, to close any Pokemon's heart if it serves their purposes. A Pinsir is useful to them not because it's legendary or irreplaceable, but because it's strong enough to help their operatives carry out crimes and willing to fight without question once its heart has been closed. This utilitarian approach to Pokemon, treating them as interchangeable tools rather than individuals with feelings and personalities, is what makes Cypher villainous. And by extension, snagging and purifying Shadow Pinsir, even though it's not the most exciting or powerful Pokemon in the game, is an act of resistance against that utilitarian worldview. You're saying that this Pokemon matters, that it deserves to be saved, not because of what it can do for you, but because it's a Pokemon that's suffering and you have the ability to help it. That's the core message of Pokemon Colosseum, and Shadow Pinsir embodies it just as much as any legendary Shadow Pokemon does. Among all the non-legendary Shadow Pokemon, Shadow Metagross stands out as perhaps the most intimidating and valuable. Metagross is a pseudo-legendary Pokemon, a category reserved for Pokemon with base stat totals of 600, putting them just below actual legendaries in terms of raw power. Encountering a corrupted Metagross means facing a Pokemon that's already incredibly strong, being used by someone who has no qualms about exploiting that strength through artificial corruption. Shadow Metagross represents the peak of what Cypher could accomplish by corrupting powerful but non-legendary Pokemon. Shadow Metagross appears in Pokemon Colosseum, where it's used by Nascor, one of the highest-ranking members of Cypher and someone who serves as a major antagonist throughout the game. Nascor isn't just any admin or operative. He's Cypher's public leader, the face of the organization before the true mastermind is revealed. Having Shadow Metagross as part of his team signals that this Pokemon is reserved for Cypher's elite, not distributed to lower-ranking members who might not be skilled enough to use it effectively. The encounter with Shadow Metagross happens late in Pokemon Colosseum, during one of the climactic battles, as you close in on Cypher's leadership. By this point in the game, you've snagged dozens of Shadow Pokemon and faced numerous challenging battles. You understand the mechanics thoroughly, and you've built a strong team. But Shadow Metagross still poses a significant threat because of its incredible stats, its steel and psychic typing, and the powerful moves it can use even in its corrupted state. Metagross's Steel and Psychic typing gives it an impressive array of resistances. It resists Normal, Flying, Rock, Steel, Grass, Ice, Dragon, Fairy, and Psychic-type moves, and it's immune to Poison. This means most of your team's attacks will deal reduced damage to it, making the battle a test of endurance and strategy. Shadow Metagross can take hits that would knock out most other Pokémon and keep fighting, all while dealing massive damage with its high attack stat and access to powerful Steel and Psychic-type moves. The intelligence factor makes Shadow Metagross particularly disturbing from a lore perspective. Metagross is described in the Pokédex as having 4 brains, formed when 2 Metang fused together during evolution. It's said to be smarter than a supercomputer, capable of complex calculations and strategic thinking that surpass most other Pokémon. Corrupting a Pokémon this intelligent means closing the heart of a creature that would be fully aware of what's being done to it, that would understand the implications of having its emotions stripped away and being reduced to a weapon. This raises uncomfortable questions about what Shadow Metagross experiences. Does it remember being intelligent and autonomous? Can it still think strategically even with its heart closed? Or does the corruption reduce it to purely instinctive behavior despite its 4 brains? The game doesn't answer these questions, but the visual of a Pokémon known for its intelligence, having red eyes and a dark aura, fighting mechanically for a trainer who doesn't care about its well-being, is one of the most unsettling images in either GameCube game. When you battle Nazgûr and encounter Shadow Metagross, the fight is genuinely difficult. Metagross has high HP, high attack, high defense, and high special defense. Its only below average stat is speed, which actually works in its favor defensively because it can take hits before striking back. As a Shadow Pokémon, it knows powerful Shadow-type moves that hit hard against your team, and if it enters reverse mode, it becomes even more unpredictable and dangerous. Snagging Shadow Metagross requires weakening it significantly without knocking it out, which is challenging given how bulky it is. You need to chip away at its HP carefully, watching for signs that it might enter reverse mode and potentially knock itself out or destroy your team. The battle is a test of everything you've learned throughout Colosseum, requiring type matchup knowledge, careful damage calculation, and awareness of the Shadow Pokémon mechanics. Once you successfully snag Shadow Metagross, you have one of the strongest Pokémon available in Colosseum. Even as a Shadow Pokémon, Metagross is incredibly powerful, and many players choose to use it extensively before purifying it simply because it's so effective in battle. But using Shadow Metagross means watching this highly intelligent Pokémon suffer in reverse mode, seeing it lose control and attack randomly, or hurt itself because its heart has been closed and it can't regulate its own behavior. The purification process for Shadow Metagross takes a long time because of how deeply it's been corrupted. Pseudo-legendary Pokémon aren't common, and Cypher presumably put extra effort into ensuring that Shadow Metagross would be a reliable weapon. Breaking through that level of corruption requires extensive use of the purification methods available in Colosseum. Whether that's calling to it during reverse mode, keeping it in your active party, or taking it to the Relic Stone, where Shadow Pokémon can be purified more quickly. When Shadow Metagross is finally purified, the transformation is dramatic. The dark aura fades, the red eyes return to their normal red color, though Metagross's eyes are naturally red, so the change is more subtle than with some Pokémon, and its behavior shifts from mechanical aggression to the calm, calculated demeanor that Metagross is known for. The purified Metagross learns powerful moves like Meteor Mash, its signature Steel-type attack, and becomes one of the best Pokémon you can have on your team for the rest of the game. What makes Shadow Metagross particularly significant is what it represents about Cypher's access to rare Pokémon. Metagross is not easy to obtain under normal circumstances. It evolves from Beldum, one of the rarest Pokémon in the main series games, given to players only as a special gift in specific games. Evolving Beldum requires training it to level 20 to become Metang, then training Metang to level 45 to become Metagross. It's a long, difficult process that requires significant time investment. Scizor somehow obtained a Metagross, or obtained a Beldum and evolved it themselves, and then corrupted it into a Shadow Pokémon. This demonstrates that Scizor has resources and capabilities far beyond what most criminal organizations in Pokémon games possess. They're not just stealing Pokémon from trainers or catching wild Pokémon and abusing them. They're specifically seeking out rare and powerful Pokémon, investing the time and effort to evolve them if necessary, and then corrupting them into Shadow Pokémon for their operatives to use. The fact that Nazcor uses Shadow Metagross also tells us about Scizor's hierarchy and how they allocate resources. Metagross isn't given to a random grunt or even a standard admin. It's reserved for one of the organization's top leaders, someone trusted with one of their most valuable assets. This suggests that Scizor operates like a military or corporate structure, where rank determines access to the best equipment and resources. Shadow Metagross is premium equipment, given only to those at the top of the organizational chart. After purification, Shadow Metagross can be transferred to the main series games, where it becomes a normal Metagross, indistinguishable from any other. Players who transferred their purified Shadow Metagross to Ruby, Sapphire, or Emerald had access to a pseudo-legendary Pokémon that was normally very difficult to obtain. This made purified Shadow Metagross valuable not just within Colosseum, but as a Pokémon that could be brought into other games and used in competitive battles or for completing the Pokédex. Shadow Metagross represents Scizor at their most competent and dangerous. This isn't the work of incompetent villains making obvious mistakes. This is an organization that identified one of the strongest, non-legendary Pokémon available, obtained it through unknown means, corrupted it successfully, and gave it to a skilled trainer who could use it effectively. Defeating Nazcor and snagging Shadow Metagross is a major victory, not just because you rescued a powerful Pokémon, but because you took one of Scizor's most valuable assets and turned it against them by purifying it and using it for good. Shadow Scizor represents one of the more interesting corrupted Pokémon because of what Scizor is as a species and what the corruption means for its particular strengths. Scizor is a bug and steel type Pokémon known for being defensive, strategic, and methodical. It evolves from Scyther through trade while holding a metal coat, transforming from a fast, fragile bug and flying type into a slower but much bulkier bug and steel type. This evolution represents a shift from speed and offense to defense and precision, and Scizor is beloved by competitive players for its technician ability and access to priority moves like Bullet Punch. Shadow Scizor appears in Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness, where it's used by Cypher admin Snaddle, another high-ranking member of the organization. Snaddle is portrayed as cunning and deceptive, someone who operates through manipulation and trickery rather than brute force. Having Shadow Scizor on his team makes sense given Scizor's strategic nature and its reputation as a Pokémon that requires careful planning to use effectively. It's not a Pokémon you just send out and spam attacks with. It's a Pokémon that rewards smart play and tactical thinking, which aligns with Snaddle's characterization. The irony of Shadow Scizor is that steel types are often associated with resilience, toughness, and having strong defenses, both physical and mental. Scizor's steel plating is described in the Pokédex as being incredibly hard, able to withstand nearly any attack. The idea that a Pokemon with such strong natural defenses could have its heart broken and closed through Cypher's process creates a thematic contradiction. Scizor should be resistant to this kind of corruption, both literally because of its steel body and metaphorically because of what steel types represent. But Cypher's technology doesn't care about type or natural resistances. A Pokemon's heart can be closed regardless of how tough it is physically. When you encounter Shadow Scizor in battle against Snaddle, you're facing a Pokemon that's both defensively strong and capable of dealing significant damage through its high attack stat. Scizor's bug and steel typing gives it 8 resistances and 1 immunity, making it difficult to exploit type advantages against it. Its only weakness is fire, which is a 4 times weakness because both bug and steel are weak to fire-type moves. This means you either need a fire-type Pokemon on your team to deal with Shadow Scizor effectively, or you need to rely on strong neutral damage to wear it down. Shadow Scizor, knowing Shadow-type moves, while corrupted, adds another layer of difficulty to the battle. These moves are powerful and super effective against non-Shadow Pokemon, allowing Shadow Scizor to punch holes in your team even if you have type advantages elsewhere. And if Shadow Scizor enters reverse mode during the battle, it becomes even more dangerous because its already high attack stat combined with uncontrolled aggression can lead to devastating attacks that knock out multiple Pokemon before you can regain control of the situation. The process of snagging Shadow Scizor requires careful damage management. You need to get its HP low enough that a Pokeball has a reasonable chance of catching it, but not so low that one more attack will knock it out. With Scizor's high defense stat, this can take multiple turns of chipping away at its health while keeping your own team alive. And because Scizor can potentially enter reverse mode and either hurt itself or use powerful attacks unexpectedly, there's always the risk that you'll lose the opportunity to snag it if things go wrong during the battle. Once you successfully snag Shadow Scizor, you gain access to one of the best physical attackers available in Pokemon XD. Even as a Shadow Pokemon, Scizor is incredibly useful in battles thanks to its typing, stats, and the power of Shadow-type moves. Many players choose to use Shadow Scizor extensively before purifying it, taking advantage of its strength while working toward eventually restoring its heart. But as with all Shadow Pokemon, using it while corrupted means witnessing reverse mode, seeing this defensive, strategic Pokemon lose control and attack mindlessly. The purification of Shadow Scizor in Pokemon XD involves using the Purify Chamber and arranging normal Pokemon around it to create the right flow of purification energy. Scizor's bug and steel typing means you need to consider these types when setting up the chamber, placing Pokemon that have advantageous type relationships to maximize the purification effect. Successfully purifying Shadow Scizor requires both patience and puzzle solving, making the eventual restoration feel earned rather than automatic. When Shadow Scizor is fully purified, it regains its normal appearance with the bright red coloring and metallic sheen that Scizor is known for. The dark aura disappears, the aggressive behavior stops, and the Pokemon returns to being the calm, methodical fighter that Scizor typically is. Purified Scizor learns moves appropriate to its level, including powerful steel-type attacks and bug-type moves that take advantage of its high attack stat. It becomes a valuable team member for the rest of the game and can be transferred to main series games where it's equally useful. What makes Shadow Scizor particularly interesting is that it's an evolved Pokemon, which means at some point, Cypher had a Scyther that they evolved into Scizor. This evolution requires specific items and trading, which are not simple processes. Cypher either had the infrastructure to trade Pokemon among themselves and the metal coat item to facilitate the evolution, or they somehow obtained an already evolved Scizor from another source. Either way, it demonstrates planning and resources beyond just catching Pokemon and corrupting them. The choice to give Shadow Scizor to Snaddle, a Cypher admin known for manipulation and strategy, reinforces the connection between trainer and Pokemon even in Cypher's corrupted system. While Shadow Pokemon are supposed to be emotionless weapons that any trainer can use, Cypher still seems to match Pokemon to trainers based on compatibility. Snaddle gets Scizor because both are strategic and methodical. This suggests that even Cypher recognizes that some trainers work better with certain Pokemon, that there's value in matching fighting styles even when the Pokemon's heart has been closed. The bug-type aspect of Shadow Scizor also adds an interesting element. Bug-type Pokemon are often overlooked or underestimated in the main series games, despite many of them being quite strong. Scizor is one of the exceptions, a bug type that's widely recognized as powerful and useful. Seeing it corrupted into a Shadow Pokemon elevates the type, showing that Cypher doesn't discriminate based on a Pokemon's type. They're willing to corrupt bug types just as readily as they'll corrupt dragon types or psychic types, recognizing that strength and utility matter more than type-based preconceptions. After purification, Shadow Scizor can be transferred to the main series games, where it becomes indistinguishable from any other Scizor. Players who move their purified Shadow Scizor to Diamond, Pearl, or Platinum had access to a powerful physical attacker with excellent typing and useful abilities. The history of being a Shadow Pokemon doesn't follow it into the new games, existing only in the player's memory as the story of how they rescued this particular Scizor from Cypher's corruption and restored it to its proper state. Shadow Hitmonlee and Shadow Hitmonchan represent a unique pairing in Cypher's Shadow Pokemon program, two Pokemon that are intrinsically linked through their shared evolution line and their contrasting fighting styles. Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan both evolve from Tyrogue, a Pokemon that can evolve into 3 different forms depending on its stats at level 20. If its attack is higher than its defense, it becomes Hitmonlee. If its defense is higher than its attack, it becomes Hitmonchan, and if both stats are equal, it becomes Hitmontop. These Pokemon are designed as counterparts, representing different approaches to combat, and seeing both of them corrupted into Shadow Pokemon highlights how Cypher's operations touched every aspect of the Pokemon world. Shadow Hitmonlee and Shadow Hitmonchan appear in Pokemon Colosseum, where they're used by different Cypher operatives throughout the game. They're not given to the same trainer, which makes sense given that they represent opposite fighting philosophies. Hitmonlee is all about kicks, with long legs that can extend to incredible lengths and deliver devastating blows from unexpected angles. Hitmonchan is all about punches, with boxing gloves for hands and fighting techniques based on human boxing styles. Having both on the same team would be redundant when Cypher could distribute them to different operatives and get more coverage across their organization. The fighting type nature of both Pokemon adds an interesting dimension to their corruption. Fighting types in Pokemon are often associated with discipline, training, and the bond between student and master. Pokemon like Machamp, Lucario, and the Hitmon line are frequently depicted as Pokemon that train rigorously, that perfect their techniques through dedication and practice. Corrupting fighting types means taking Pokemon that embody discipline and turning them into mindless weapons that fight without strategy or purpose beyond causing harm. Shadow Hitmonlee's fighting style becomes particularly disturbing when viewed through the lens of corruption. Hitmonlee is known for its precise kicks, its ability to target weak points with pinpoint accuracy, and its balance that allows it to stand on one leg while delivering powerful attacks with the other. These abilities require focus, control, and awareness of one's body and surroundings. A Shadow Hitmonlee with a closed heart would still have the physical capability to perform these techniques, but without the mental discipline that makes them effective. It would be kicking mechanically, attacking without the strategy and precision that defines Hitmonlee as a species. Shadow Hitmonchan faces a similar degradation. Hitmonchan is based on boxing, a combat sport that requires incredible mental discipline alongside physical strength. Boxers need to read their opponents, anticipate attacks, and respond with counters and combinations that exploit openings. A Shadow Hitmonchan loses this mental component, reduced to throwing punches without the tactical thinking that makes Hitmonchan effective. The Pokemon's boxing gloves become just weapons rather than tools for skilled combat. When you encounter Shadow Hitmonlee or Shadow Hitmonchan in battle, you're facing Pokemon with strong attack stats and access to powerful fighting-type moves. Hitmonlee has higher attack and speed, making it a fast physical attacker that can hit hard before opponents respond. Hitmonchan has more balanced stats, with slightly better defenses, allowing it to take hits while dealing damage. Both Pokemon benefit from Stab, same type attack bonus, on fighting type moves, and as Shadow Pokemon they also have access to Shadow type moves that can surprise opponents who expect purely physical fighting attacks. The process of snagging either Shadow Hitmonlee or Shadow Hitmonchan requires dealing with their respectable attack stats and the risk that they'll knock out members of your team before you can weaken them enough to catch. Fighting types are strong against normal, rock, steel, ice, and dark type Pokemon, meaning they have good coverage and can threaten a variety of opponents. You need to use Pokemon with resistances to fighting type moves, like flying, psychic, or fairy types, to safely chip away at their health without getting knocked out yourself. Once snagged, Shadow Hitmonlee and Shadow Hitmonchan can be useful additions to your team, even while corrupted. Fighting type coverage is valuable in Colosseum because many trainer battles include normal and dark type Pokemon that fighting types are strong against. But using them while they're still Shadow Pokemon means watching these disciplined fighters lose control in reverse mode, attacking randomly, or hurting themselves because the mental focus that should govern their fighting style has been stripped away by Cypher's corruption. The purification of Shadow Hitmonlee and Shadow Hitmonchan is significant because it represents restoring not just their hearts, but their fighting discipline. When these Pokemon are purified, they don't just regain the ability to feel emotions. They regain the mental clarity and focus that makes their fighting styles effective. A purified Hitmonlee can once again calculate the perfect angle for its kicks. A purified Hitmonchan can read opponents and counter their moves with boxing combinations. The purification returns them to being martial artists rather than just brawlers. What makes the Hitmon line particularly interesting in the context of Shadow Pokemon is their evolutionary origin. At some point, Cypher had Tyrogue that they either caught or stole, and they evolved them into Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan. This means they had to know which stats were higher before evolution, ensuring they got the specific evolution they wanted. Cypher's operation shows planning and knowledge of Pokemon mechanics, treating evolution as a tool to create specific types of Shadow Pokemon, rather than as something that happens naturally through training and bonding. The fact that Cypher bothered to create both Shadow Hitmonlee and Shadow Hitmonchan, rather than just one, suggests they wanted coverage across different fighting styles. They weren't just corrupting Pokemon randomly. They were building a diverse army of Shadow Pokemon with different strengths, typings, and strategies. Having both the kicking specialist and the punching specialist means Cypher operatives could choose which fighting type suited their battle style, just like having Shadow Gliscor and Shadow Metagross gave them options for defensive and offensive strategies. After purification, Shadow Hitmonlee and Shadow Hitmonchan become normal fighting types that can be transferred to main series games. Players who moved these Pokemon to Ruby, Sapphire, or Emerald had access to solid fighting type options that were harder to obtain in those games, especially Hitmonlee, which required specific stat training to get from Tyrogue. The history of being Shadow Pokemon doesn't follow them, but for the player who rescued and purified them, these Pokemon carry the story of being saved from corruption and restored to their proper forms as disciplined fighters rather than mindless weapons. The legendary birds of Kanto, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, represent some of the most iconic legendary Pokemon in the entire franchise. They were among the first legendary Pokemon ever introduced, appearing in the original Red and Blue games as rare, powerful creatures that required skill and preparation to capture. Each bird embodies a different elemental force. Articuno controls ice and winter, Zapdos commands electricity and storms, and Moltres rules over fire and heat. These Pokemon are tied to nature itself, to the fundamental forces that shape weather and climate. And in Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, all three of them appear as shadow Pokemon, corrupted by Cypher and stripped of their connection to the natural world they're supposed to embody. Shadow Articuno, Shadow Zapdos, and Shadow Moltres don't appear together as a set. They're distributed among different Cypher members throughout Pokemon XD, encountered at different points in the story. This distribution pattern reflects Cypher's strategy of spreading their most valuable assets across their organization rather than concentrating them all with one trainer. Each legendary bird is given to a different high-ranking member, ensuring that Cypher's leadership has access to legendary power while also making it harder for anyone to defeat the organization by simply beating one trainer. Shadow Articuno is an ice and flying type Pokemon, known in normal circumstances for its association with frozen landscapes and its ability to create blizzards. The Pokédex describes Articuno as appearing to people lost in icy mountains, either guiding them to safety or freezing them depending on interpretations. It's a Pokemon connected to mercy and cold beauty, to the harsh but sometimes benevolent nature of winter. Corrupting Articuno means severing that connection to its elemental nature, turning a Pokemon that represents the majesty of ice into a weapon that uses ice purely for destruction. The visual of Shadow Articuno is particularly striking because Articuno is normally such an elegant Pokemon. Its blue and white coloring, its long tail feathers, its graceful flight patterns, all of these communicate a Pokemon that's beautiful and serene despite its power. Shadow Articuno retains the physical form but loses the grace. The dark aura surrounds it, the red eyes replace its normally gentle expression, and when it fights, it's with mechanical aggression rather than the calculated precision you'd expect from a legendary Pokemon. It's Articuno's body without Articuno's spirit, a corruption that's visible not just in the shadow Pokemon effects, but in how wrong it feels to see this particular Pokemon behave this way. Shadow Zapdos represents a different kind of corruption. Zapdos is an electric and flying type Pokemon associated with thunderstorms and lightning strikes. It's described as appearing during storms, its wings crackling with electricity, and in some legends it's said that Zapdos creates the thunder that accompanies lightning. This Pokemon embodies raw power and energy, the unstoppable force of a lightning bolt channeled into a living creature. Corrupting Zapdos means taking that natural electrical power and forcing it to serve Cypher's purposes rather than existing as a force of nature. The danger of Shadow Zapdos in battle is significant because Zapdos has excellent special attack and speed stats, making it a fast and powerful special attacker even among legendary Pokémon. As a Shadow Pokémon, it gains access to Shadow-type moves on top of its already impressive Electric-type attacks, giving it the ability to devastate teams that aren't prepared for it. And because it's a legendary bird with naturally high stats, Shadow Zapdos is bulky enough to take hits while also being fast enough to attack before most opponents can respond. Weakening it enough to snag without knocking it out requires careful planning and often some luck. Shadow Moltres completes the trio as the fire and flying type legendary bird. Moltres is associated with volcanoes and intense heat, described as bringing early spring wherever it flies and causing flames to erupt from its wings with every flap. It's a Pokémon that represents renewal through fire, the way forest fires clear old growth and allow new life to emerge. There's a cycle to Moltres, a connection to rebirth and transformation that makes it more than just a fire Pokémon. Corrupting Moltres breaks that cycle, turning a Pokémon of renewal into a Pokémon of pure destruction. What makes the corruption of all three legendary birds particularly meaningful is that these Pokémon are supposed to exist in balance. In Pokémon lore, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres represent different aspects of natural forces that must coexist for the world to function properly. Ice, lightning, and fire are all necessary elements of nature, and the legendary birds embody the power and importance of these forces. By corrupting all three and distributing them to different cipher members, the organization is symbolically breaking the natural balance that these Pokémon represent. They're not just using legendary Pokémon as weapons. They're disrupting the fundamental order of nature. The battles where you encounter each Shadow legendary bird are among the most challenging in Pokémon XD. These are legendary Pokémon with base stat totals of 580, giving them significantly higher stats than most Pokémon you'll have at that point in the game. They know powerful Shadow-type moves, they have strong stab attacks from their respective types, and they can enter reverse mode during battle, making them even more unpredictable and dangerous. You need to bring strong Pokémon with type advantages, carry plenty of healing items, and be prepared for battles that might take multiple attempts to win. Snagging all three legendary birds requires persistence and strategy. Articuno's Ice-type moves can freeze your Pokémon, potentially ending their ability to fight. Zapdos's Electric-type attacks hit hard and fast, and its Thunder Wave can paralyze your team. Moltres' Fire-type moves can burn Pokémon, causing them to take damage over time and reducing their physical attack power. Each bird presents different challenges, and successfully snagging all three means overcoming Ice, Electric, and Fire-type threats, while managing the additional danger of Shadow-type moves and reverse mode. Once you've snagged the Shadow legendary birds, you face a decision that many players find difficult. These Pokémon are incredibly powerful even while corrupted, and using them in their Shadow forms gives you access to legendary level strength that can steamroll through most of the remaining game content. But using Shadow Articuno, Shadow Zapdos, and Shadow Moltres while they're still corrupted means watching legendary Pokémon, creatures that should be majestic and awe-inspiring, lose control and hurt themselves in reverse mode. It means taking advantage of their corruption rather than working to fix it. The purification process for legendary Pokémon takes significantly longer than for common Pokémon. Cipher put extra effort into corrupting the legendary birds, closing their hearts more thoroughly than they would for a Pokémon like Houndour or Beedrill. Breaking through that level of corruption requires extensive use of the Purify Chamber, carefully arranging Pokémon around each legendary bird to maximize the purification energy flow. The process can take hours of real-world time, with players repeatedly checking the purification meter and adjusting their chamber setup to optimize the rate of purification. When Shadow Articuno is finally purified, the transformation is profound. The dark aura dissipates, revealing Articuno's natural blue and white coloring in all its glory. The red eyes return to their normal black, and the Pokemon's behavior shifts from mechanical aggression to the serene, graceful presence that Articuno is supposed to have. Purified Articuno learns Ice-type moves like Ice Beam and Blizzard, powerful special attacks that take advantage of its good special attack stat. It becomes a valuable team member and a testament to the player's dedication to rescuing even the most challenging Shadow Pokémon. Shadow Zapdos's purification is equally dramatic. The electric energy that crackles around it changes quality when the corruption is removed, shifting from chaotic and dangerous to controlled and powerful. Purified Zapdos regains access to its strongest electric-type moves like Thunder and Thunderbolt, and its presence on your team shifts from being a corrupted weapon to being a legendary partner that chose to stay with you after being rescued. The relationship between trainer and legendary Pokémon is supposed to be special, earned through proving yourself worthy, and purifying Shadow Zapdos feels like earning that relationship in a different way than simply catching it in the wild. Shadow Moltres' purification completes the restoration of the legendary bird trio. When the dark aura fades and Moltres' natural orange and yellow flames return, it represents not just rescuing one Pokémon, but restoring balance to the trio as a whole. All three legendary birds purified means that the natural forces they represent are no longer under Cypher's control, that ice and lightning and fire can exist in their proper balance rather than being tools for criminal purposes. Purified Moltres learns fire-type moves like Flamethrower and Fire Blast, becoming the powerful special attacker it's meant to be. What's particularly interesting about the legendary birds in Pokémon XD is that they can be transferred to the main series games after purification, but there's a uniqueness to them that doesn't exist for most other Shadow Pokémon. In the main series games, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres are typically available as static encounters or roaming Pokémon that you can catch through normal gameplay. But the purified Shadow legendary birds from XD are different because they carry the memory of being rescued from corruption, of being saved by a trainer who went to extraordinary effort to restore them. For players who transferred their purified legendary birds to Fire Red, Leaf Green, or Emerald, these Pokémon became permanent members of their collection with a history that made them special. They weren't just legendary Pokémon. They were legendary Pokémon that had been corrupted to the point of losing their connection to nature itself and then restored through the player's dedication. That narrative weight doesn't show up in the Pokémon's stats or moves, but it exists in the player's relationship with these specific Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres. The corruption of the legendary birds also raises questions about Cypher's capabilities that the game never fully answers. How did they capture Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres in the first place? These are legendary Pokémon that appear rarely, that are incredibly powerful even without being corrupted, and that would presumably resist being caught by an evil organization. Cypher must have had resources, technology, or knowledge that allowed them to locate and capture all three legendary birds, then successfully corrupt them into Shadow Pokémon. This suggests that Cypher's operations extended far beyond the Ori region, that they had the capability to track down and capture legendary Pokémon from other regions. The legendary birds represent the pinnacle of what Cypher could accomplish with Shadow Pokémon technology, excluding only Shadow Lugia, which was in a category of its own as XD1. These were fully realized legendary Pokémon not experiments or prototypes that had been successfully corrupted and distributed to Cypher's leadership. The fact that all three could be purified proves that even legendary Pokémon aren't beyond saving, that no corruption is so complete that it can't be reversed with enough effort and care. And for players who took on the challenge of snagging and purifying all three Shadow legendary birds, the reward was more than just having powerful Pokémon on their team. It was the satisfaction of restoring balance to nature, of taking creatures that represent fundamental forces and freeing them from Cypher's control so they could be what they were always meant to be.